September 12th, 1943. Rechlin Luftwaffe Test Center, Germany. Hauptmann Werner Maltzahn steadied his breathing as he settled into the cockpit of the captured American fighter, its distinctive inverted gull wings catching the early morning light like the bent wings of a predatory bird. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair had arrived 3 weeks earlier, recovered from a Norwegian beach where its pilot had made an emergency landing after running out of fuel during a British carrier strike. The young American had been captured, the aircraft remarkably intact. Now, Germany's best test pilots would discover what made this unusual fighter tick. Maltzahn, a veteran with over 400 combat missions across 3 fronts, had flown every significant fighter in the Luftwaffe inventory. He had tested captured Spitfires, Hurricanes, P-38s, and P-47s. He approached each evaluation with professional detachment, cataloging strengths and weaknesses for German pilots who would face these machines in combat. The Corsair, he assumed, would be no different. Another American fighter, probably heavy, probably powerful in a straight line, probably lacking the finesse of German engineering. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong those assumptions were. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double wasp engine rumbled to life with a deep-throated roar that shook the entire airframe. 2,800 horsepower, more than any single-engine fighter the Germans had encountered. Maltzahn ran through the pre-flight checklist, noting the peculiar design choices. The cockpit sat far back on the fuselage, giving the aircraft an aggressive, nose-heavy appearance. The long nose stretched ahead like the snout of a hunting dog. Visibility over that nose during ground operations was terrible, he noted. A dangerous flaw for carrier operations, but meaningless for land-based combat. What German intelligence had failed to grasp, what no amount of studying wreckage and interrogating pilots could reveal, was how this ungainly-looking fighter would handle once airborne. The test flight that September morning would fundamentally alter Luftwaffe tactical doctrine and send shockwaves through German fighter command. Within 30 minutes, Maltzahn would radio the tower with a message that would be forwarded immediately to Reich Marshal Hermann Göring himself. The Americans have created something extraordinary. We have nothing that can match it in close combat. The Corsair's development had begun in February 1938 when the United States Navy issued a requirement for a single-seat carrier fighter with performance exceeding anything then flying. Chief designer Rex Beisel and his team at Chance Vought faced an impossible equation. The Navy wanted a fighter that could exceed 400 miles per hour, carry significant firepower, operate from carrier decks, and possess the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. These requirements contradicted everything known about aircraft design. Speed demanded power, which meant a large engine. Large engines were heavy. Heavy fighters couldn't operate from carriers. And yet the Navy insisted all requirements were non-negotiable. Beisel's solution was radical. He would mount the most powerful engine available, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800, and design the airframe around it. But the enormous 13-foot diameter propeller required to absorb that power presented a problem. Making the landing gear tall enough to provide propeller clearance would create a structure too long and weak for carrier operations. The landing gear would collapse during the violent arrested landings that characterized carrier aviation. The solution became the Corsair's most distinctive feature, the inverted gull wing. By bending the wing downward at the root, Beisel could mount shorter, stronger landing gear while maintaining propeller clearance. The design was aerodynamically efficient, reducing drag where the wing joined the fuselage. It was structurally sound, creating a natural load path for the landing gear, and it was visually striking, giving the aircraft an appearance unlike anything else in the sky. But the inverted gull wing was merely the foundation for what would become the most maneuverable fighter of the war. The wing itself was a masterpiece of aerodynamic engineering, a low mounted on the fuselage with a pronounced dihedral in the outer panels. It provided exceptional roll rate and stability. The ailerons were large and powerful, giving the pilot enormous control authority. The entire wing was extraordinarily strong, stressed to handle loads that would tear the wings off most fighters. This strength would prove crucial, allowing pilots to execute maneuvers at speeds and G-forces that would destroy lesser aircraft. The prototype XF4U-1 first flew on May 29, 1940, and immediately demonstrated performance that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Test pilot Lyman A. Bullard Jr. pushed the aircraft to 405 miles per hour in level flight, making it the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour. The climb rate was spectacular, nearly 3,000 feet per minute at sea level. The dive performance was extraordinary, with the aircraft remaining controllable at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. But it was the handling characteristics that truly set the Corsair apart. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could outturn, outroll, and outclimb virtually any opponent. The massive engine provided thrust-to-weight ratio that enabled vertical maneuvers impossible for other fighters. The pilot could point the nose straight up and climb on pure power, hanging on the propeller in a display that seemed to defy physics. More significantly, the Corsair could sustain high G turns without losing energy, where other fighters bled speed in hard turns, requiring the pilot to choose between maintaining airspeed and maintaining the turn. The Corsair's powerful engine could maintain both. A skilled pilot could enter a hard-turning fight at 300 miles per hour and exit at 300 miles per hour, having circled inside his opponent while maintaining enough energy for the next engagement. The armament was devastating. 6 Browning M2 50-caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun. Total ammunition capacity of 2,400 rounds, enough for sustained combat. The guns were mounted far enough outboard that convergence patterns could be adjusted for various ranges, but close enough to the fuselage that dispersion remained tight. At typical combat ranges of 300 to 500 yards, all 6 guns could place their fire into a zone roughly 4 feet in diameter. Aircraft caught in that cone of fire didn't merely take damage, they disintegrated. Yet, despite this performance, the Corsair nearly failed to reach combat. The Navy, after extensive carrier trials in 1942, declared the aircraft unsuitable for carrier operations. The long nose created dangerous visibility problems during the critical moments of carrier approach and landing. The stiff landing gear bounced on carrier decks, causing the aircraft to leap back into the air during attempted landings. Most dangerously, the aircraft had a tendency to stall without warning during the slow-speed approaches required for carrier landings, dropping a wing and spinning into the ocean before the pilot could react. The Navy rejected the Corsair for carrier use and assigned it to Marine Corps land-based squadrons instead. The Marines, desperate for a fighter that could match the Japanese Zero in combat, accepted the troublesome Corsair gratefully. They would learn to work around its vices and exploit its virtues. What they discovered would revolutionize fighter combat in the Pacific and send shockwaves through both Japanese and German intelligence services. The first Marine Corsair Squadron, VMF-124, arrived at Guadalcanal in February 1943 under the command of Major William E. Gies. The Japanese pilots, who had dominated Pacific skies for over a year, initially welcomed the appearance of a new American fighter. Their intelligence had characterized it as large, heavy, and likely to be clumsy in combat, another American attempt to use brute force to compensate for inferior design. The first encounter between Corsairs and Zeros occurred on February 14, 1943, over the Russell Islands. 12 Corsairs of VMF-124 met 16 Zeros in a swirling dogfight that would establish the pattern for every subsequent engagement. The Japanese pilots, confident in their superior maneuverability, executed their standard tactics, attempting to force turning fights where the Zero's light wing loading and responsive controls gave it the advantage. What happened next shocked every Japanese pilot who survived. The Corsairs didn't try to avoid the turning fight. They turned with the Zeros, matching them degree for degree, then accelerating out of the turns with power the Japanese couldn't match. When Zeros attempted to dive away, the Corsairs followed, accelerating in the dive until they overtook the Japanese fighters and destroyed them with concentrated machine gun fire. When Zeros attempted to climb away, the Corsairs climbed with them, then passed them, their massive engines pulling them upward while the Japanese fighters struggled for altitude. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. 5 Zeros fell in flames. Every Corsair returned to base. Lieutenant Ken Walsh, who had become one of the war's top aces with 21 victories, described the shock on Japanese faces during that first encounter. I got on a Zero's tail in a turn. He tightened his turn, expecting me to slide wide. I stayed right with him, matching his turn exactly. I could see the pilot's head turning. Looking back at me, even through the distance, I could see the surprise on his face. He couldn't believe an American fighter was staying with him. Then I pulled the trigger, and he stopped believing anything. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war to write extensively about his experiences, encountered Corsairs over Rabaul in 1943. His assessment, shared with Japanese intelligence and later captured by American forces, revealed the profound impact. The new American fighter has destroyed our tactical advantage. The Zero's maneuverability, which gave us superiorities over all previous American types, is meaningless against this aircraft. The Corsair can turn with us, but it can also do what we cannot. It can dive faster, climb faster, and fly faster in level flight. Its pilot can choose when to engage and when to break off. We have no such choice. We must fight when the Corsair pilot decides, and fight on his terms. By mid-1943, captured Corsair fragments and intelligence reports were flowing to Germany through Japanese channels. The Germans, fighting their own desperate air war over Europe, studied the reports with intense interest. Their initial assessment mirrored Japanese conclusions. A heavy, powerful fighter, probably lacking finesse, certainly inferior to German designs in maneuverability. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, they believed, would make short work of these American machines should they appear over Europe. The capture of the intact Corsair in Norway in September 1943 provided an opportunity to test these assumptions directly. The aircraft that landed on that Norwegian beach had been flown by Ensign Richard Dunn of VF-17, the famous Jolly Roger squadron operating from the British carrier HMS Victorious during his strikes against German shipping. A fuel system malfunction had forced him down, and German troops captured him before he could destroy the aircraft. The Corsair, damaged but repairable, was transported to the Rechlin Test Center, where Germany's finest test pilots would evaluate it against their own fighters. Hauptmann Werner was chosen to conduct the initial evaluation because of his extensive experience with both German and captured Allied fighters. He had written the tactical assessments that helped Luftwaffe pilots develop counters to the Spitfire and P-47. His reports were known for their clinical precision and lack of bias. He called aircraft as he saw them, praising strengths and noting weaknesses without regard to national origin. His reputation for objectivity made his subsequent report on the Corsair all the more shocking to German high command. The test flight began with standard evaluation procedures. Maltzahn took off from Rechlin's main runway, noting the aircraft's tendency to torque roll to the left during the takeoff run. The enormous engine produced so much rotational force that it tried to twist the entire aircraft. Full right rudder was required to maintain directional control. The visibility over the long nose during takeoff was indeed terrible, requiring the pilot to lean out and look around the nose to see where he was going. These were significant flaws, Maltzahn noted, but not unusual for powerful fighters. German pilots dealt with similar issues in the Focke-Wulf 190. Once airborne, everything changed. Maltzahn retracted the landing gear and felt the aircraft surge forward as drag reduced. He advanced the throttle to full power, and the Corsair leapt ahead with acceleration that pressed him back into his seat. The airspeed indicator wound up rapidly. 300 kilometers per hour, 350, 400, 450. The aircraft was still accelerating smoothly with no sign of the buffeting or control stiffness that typically accompanied high speeds. At 500 kilometers per hour, roughly 310 miles per hour, Maltzahn leveled off and began maneuvering. He started with gentle turns, feeling how the aircraft responded to control inputs. The ailerons were crisp and responsive. A slight stick movement produced immediate roll. He increased the bank angle, noting how the aircraft tracked precisely through the turn without any tendency to slip or skid. He pulled harder, loading the aircraft with G-forces. 3 Gs, 4 Gs. The Corsair held the turn without complaint, the wing showing no sign of buffeting or stall. He pulled harder still, grunting against the G-forces compressing his chest. 5 Gs, 6 Gs. The turn tightened dramatically, the horizon spinning past the canopy. Still no stall, no buffet, no loss of control, just smooth, powerful, precise maneuvering. Maltzahn rolled out of the turn and sat stunned in the cockpit, his mind processing what he had just experienced. He had just pulled 6 Gs in a sustained turn, and the aircraft had responded as if he had asked for 3. The turn rate had been extraordinary, comparable to the Messerschmitt 109 at its best, but without any loss of airspeed. The engine's power had been sufficient to maintain speed throughout the turn. This should not be possible. A fighter this size, with this much weight, should not be able to turn like a lightweight interceptor. He tried a series of rapid roll reversals, snapping the stick from full left to full right deflection. The Corsair responded instantly, rolling from 90 degrees of bank in one direction to 90 degrees in the opposite direction in just over 1 second. The roll rate was spectacular, exceeding even the Focke-Wulf 190, which was renowned for its excellent roll performance. He tried a vertical climb, pointing the nose straight up and applying full power. The Corsair climbed vertically for over 3,000 feet before airspeed decayed enough to require leveling off. No German fighter could do that. Even the Messerschmitt 109, with its excellent climb rate, would have stalled and fallen away after perhaps 1,500 feet of vertical climb. Maltzahn attempted one more maneuver, one that would crystallize his assessment and shock German high command. He climbed to 6,000 meters, rolled inverted, and pulled through into a split S, a diving half-loop used to reverse direction quickly. The Corsair rolled smoothly into the inverted position. He pulled back on the stick, loading the aircraft with negative G-forces as it arced downward through the bottom of the loop. At the bottom, screaming downward at over 600 kilometers per hour, he pulled hard, converting that diving speed into a climbing zoom. The aircraft shot upward, using its momentum to gain altitude while maintaining enough airspeed to remain fully controllable. At the top of the zoom, he was 2,000 meters higher than where he had started, with enough speed remaining to immediately engage any opponent. The maneuver had taken perhaps 20 seconds and demonstrated capabilities that rewrote everything German pilots knew about energy management in combat. The Corsair could enter and exit high G maneuvers while maintaining or even gaining energy. This violated the fundamental principle that had governed air combat since the First World War, that aggressive maneuvering cost energy, forcing pilots to choose between position and speed. The American fighter seemed exempt from this law of physics. Maltzahn landed 45 minutes after takeoff and immediately requested a meeting with the base commander. His written report, filed that afternoon and forwarded to Berlin within hours, contained language unprecedented in German test pilot assessments. The enemy aircraft demonstrates flight characteristics superior to all German types in nearly every performance parameter. Maneuverability equals or exceeds the Messerschmitt 109. Roll rate exceeds the Focke-Wulf 190. Climb rate and acceleration exceed both German types significantly. Most concerning, the aircraft can sustain high G maneuvering without energy loss, allowing the pilot to maintain offensive position indefinitely. The report concluded with a stark tactical assessment. German pilots encountering this aircraft in combat should avoid close-range maneuvering engagement at all costs. The standard tactics, developed against previous American types, will prove suicidal against this fighter. Boom and zoom attacks from altitude with immediate disengagement offer the only viable tactical option. Even this may prove insufficient given the aircraft's superior climb rate and acceleration. The report landed on the desk of General Adolf Galland, general of the fighter arm, within 24 hours. Galland, himself an ace, with over 100 victories, initially questioned whether Maltzahn had somehow been deceived or had allowed enthusiasm to cloud his judgment. He ordered additional test flights by other pilots, including several of Germany's top aces who were rotated home for rest between combat tours. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's leading aces with over 200 victories on both Eastern and Western fronts, flew the Corsair on September 18, 1943. His report echoed Maltzahn's assessment, but went further. I have flown against every fighter the Soviets and British operate. I have studied captured Spitfires and American types extensively. Nothing prepares you for this aircraft. It combines the maneuverability of a lightweight fighter with the speed and power of a heavy interceptor. This should be aerodynamically impossible, yet the Americans have achieved it. More disturbing is the realization that if this is what they are producing for their Navy, what are they building for their Army Air Force? We may be facing an enemy whose industrial capability has given them insurmountable technological advantage. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a veteran commander with over 150 victories, tested the Corsair on September 22nd and added another dimension to the assessment. The aircraft's strength is not merely in its performance, but in how that performance translates to combat advantage. The pilot sits high in the fuselage with excellent visibility. The cockpit is spacious and well-arranged. The controls are harmonized perfectly, requiring no awkward or excessive movements. An average pilot in this aircraft would outfly an expert in our best fighters, simply because the machine amplifies his abilities, while our aircraft demand perfection merely to survive. The German High Command faced an uncomfortable reality. Their intelligence assessments had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans were not brute force engineers lacking finesse. They had created a fighter that combined raw power with sophisticated aerodynamics to achieve performance German designers had considered impossible. Worse, this was just one of multiple advanced American types entering service. The P-51 Mustang was beginning to appear over Europe with range and performance that threatened to make German fighters irrelevant in their own skies. Galland convened a meeting of senior fighter commanders in October 1943 to discuss the implications. The mood in the conference room was grim. Germany was already losing the technological race. The Allies had radar-equipped night fighters decimating German bomber formations. They had long-range escorts that were stripping away the Luftwaffe's defensive capabilities, and now they had fighters whose capabilities exceeded German types in nearly every measurable parameter. Major Günther Rauhl, another leading ace, summarized the situation bluntly. We have been outdesigned, outproduced, and outclassed. Our fighters were optimized for the war we fought in 1940. The Americans are building fighters for the war they intend to fight in 1945 and beyond. We cannot match their industrial capacity. We cannot match their technological advancement. We can only hope to make their victory as costly as possible. The captured Corsair remained at Rechlin through the end of 1943, used to train German pilots in recognition and tactics for countering the American fighter should it appear over Europe. In reality, the Corsair never operated in significant numbers over Germany. It remained primarily a Pacific theater weapon, where its capabilities made it the dominant naval fighter of the war. But the lessons learned from that captured aircraft influenced German tactical thinking profoundly. German fighter pilots were instructed to avoid close combat with all American fighters when possible, to use altitude and speed advantages to make quick attacks and to disengage immediately. The days of swirling dogfights where German pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability could prevail were ending. The Americans had brought industrial warfare to the skies, and they were winning. In the Pacific, the Corsair was rewriting the rules of carrier aviation and air combat. The initial Navy rejection proved premature. By late 1944, modified Corsairs with improved stall characteristics and better visibility began operating from carriers. The aircraft that had been declared unsuitable for carrier operations became the Navy's primary carrier fighter, serving on fleet carriers throughout the final year of the war. The combat record was extraordinary. Marine and Navy Corsair pilots achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft, the highest of any American fighter in the Pacific. The aircraft destroyed over 2,000 Japanese planes in air-to-air combat, while losing fewer than 200 Corsairs to enemy fighters. More significantly, the Corsair's maneuverability allowed pilots to engage Japanese fighters on their own terms and win consistently. Lieutenant Ira Kepford of VF-17 achieved 16 victories flying Corsairs from Bougainville, describing the aircraft's capabilities in combat. The Japanese pilots couldn't understand how we could stay with them in turns. They had built their entire tactical doctrine around superior maneuverability. When that advantage disappeared, they had nothing left. We could outturn them, outclimb them, outdive them, and outgun them. It wasn't a fair fight. The human cost on the Japanese side was staggering. Experienced pilots who had dominated Pacific skies in 1942 found themselves suddenly outclassed. The Zero, which had been superior to every early war American fighter, became a death trap against the Corsair. Japanese pilots developed the same psychological trauma German pilots experienced against American heavy fighters. They called the Corsair Whistling Death because of the distinctive sound its air intake made during high-speed dives. That sound became synonymous with death from above. Among the Corsair's most successful pilots was Major Gregory Boyington, commanding Marine Fighting Squadron 214, the famous Black Sheep Squadron. Boyington, a former Flying Tiger who had fought in China before Pearl Harbor, understood both Japanese tactics and aircraft capabilities intimately. He used the Corsair's superior performance to develop aggressive tactics that maximized the aircraft's advantages. His squadron achieved 94 confirmed kills in 84 days of combat, with Boyington personally downing 22 Japanese aircraft before being shot down and captured in January 1944. His replacement, Major Stan Bailey, continued the aggressive tactics, and the Black Sheep ended the war with over 150 confirmed victories, the highest-scoring Marine squadron of the war. The Corsair proved equally devastating in ground attack roles. The aircraft could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs or 8 5-inch rockets while retaining its full air-to-air capability. Japanese ground forces learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of the inverted gull wings as much as Japanese pilots did. The combination of heavy firepower, high speed, and excellent maneuverability made the Corsair the most effective close air support aircraft in the Pacific. During the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, Corsairs flew over 5,000 close air support sorties, destroying Japanese artillery positions, supply dumps, and fortifications with devastating accuracy. The aircraft could dive steeply to attack targets hidden in ravines or behind hills, deliver its ordnance with precision, and then pull up sharply to avoid ground fire. Pilots described it as flying a fighter that thought it was a dive bomber, but forgot to sacrifice any fighter capabilities. By April 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Corsair had become the most produced American carrier fighter, with over 12,500 built. Production continued after VJ Day, and the aircraft remained in frontline service through the Korean War, where it proved effective against Soviet-designed jets. The final Corsair wasn't retired from active military service until 1965, when the last examples serving with Honduras were finally grounded. No other World War II fighter served in frontline combat roles for so long. The irony of the Corsair's story was lost on no one who studied it seriously. The Germans and Japanese had entered the war confident in their superior design philosophy. They built lightweight, nimble fighters, optimized for dogfighting. They trained their pilots extensively in aerial combat tactics that exploited maneuverability advantages. They developed elaborate tactical doctrines based on the assumption that their fighters could outturn and outclimb any opponent. The Americans, arriving late to the war, studied these assumptions and concluded they were wrong. They built fighters that combined power, speed, and sophisticated aerodynamics to achieve maneuverability equal to or better than lightweight fighters, while maintaining significant advantages in firepower, protection, and pilot survivability. The Corsair represented the ultimate expression of this philosophy. An aircraft that German and Japanese engineers would have dismissed as too heavy, too powerful, too complex. Yet it outmaneuvered their carefully optimized designs while also outclimbing them, outdiving them, and outfighting them in every measurable way. Hauptmann Maltzahn survived the war and emigrated to Argentina in 1947, where he worked as a civilian test pilot. In 1968, he was interviewed by aviation historians researching the Rechlin Test Center's evaluations of captured Allied aircraft. Asked about the Corsair evaluation, he was quiet for a long moment before responding. Flying that aircraft was the moment I knew we had lost the war, not because of that one fighter, but because of what it represented. The Americans had taken every lesson from early war combat, applied unlimited industrial resources and engineering talent, and created something that exceeded our best efforts in every way. And they built them by the thousands, while we struggled to build hundreds of inferior aircraft. The most frightening part was realizing this was normal for them. They built escort carriers faster than we could sink them. They produced bombers in numbers that made our interceptors meaningless. They trained pilots in months to standards that took us years to achieve. The Corsair was simply another example of American industrial and technological superiority. When I landed that day in September 1943, I wrote a report that said we could not compete with this aircraft. What I should have written was that we could not compete with the nation that built it. In Japan, the few surviving aces who had encountered Corsairs in combat reflected similarly on their experiences. Saburo Sakai, who survived nearly 600 combat missions and over 60 victories, wrote extensively in the post-war period about the transformation in aerial combat the Corsair represented. We thought maneuverability was everything. We built the Zero to turn inside any opponent. We trained our pilots in dogfighting tactics perfected over years of combat. Then the Americans arrived with the Corsair and everything we knew became obsolete. It could turn with us, but it didn't need to. It could climb above us and dive on us at speeds we couldn't match. It could absorb damage that would destroy 3 Zeros and keep fighting. And there were always more of them. For every Corsair we shot down, 5 more appeared. For every American pilot killed, 3 arrived as replacements, fully trained and eager for combat. We were fighting industrial warfare with samurai swords. The outcome was inevitable from the moment they decided to win. The cost in human lives was incalculable. Japanese fighter pilot casualties approached 80% by war's end. The experienced pilots who had dominated the Pacific in 1942 were gone, replaced by barely trained teenagers who survived an average of 3 combat missions. German fighter pilots on the Western Front faced similar attrition rates. The technology gap combined with overwhelming numbers to make survival increasingly unlikely. Each pilot who climbed into a Messerschmitt or Zero knew he was facing aircraft superior in nearly every measurable way, flown by pilots with better training, supported by unlimited industrial capacity. The psychological impact was devastating. Combat units reported increasing instances of combat fatigue, breakdown, and refusal to fly. Pilots developed physical symptoms of stress before missions. Some simply failed to return from missions where their aircraft showed no combat damage, suggesting they had chosen to land in neutral territory rather than face certain death. The memoirs and combat reports revealed men who understood they were fighting a losing battle but continued anyway, driven by duty, loyalty, or simple stubborn courage. The technological race that produced the Corsair and other advanced American fighters represented a fundamental shift in how wars were fought and won. Previous conflicts had been decided by tactical brilliance, superior training, or numerical advantage. World War II demonstrated that industrial capacity and technological innovation could overcome all traditional military advantages. The nation that could design, produce, and field superior weapons in overwhelming numbers would prevail regardless of enemy tactical skill or fighting spirit. This lesson resonated through subsequent conflicts, driving the Cold War arms race and fundamentally altering military strategic thinking. But beneath the statistics and technological assessments lay the human dimension. Each aircraft shot down represented a life ended, a family destroyed, a future erased. The Corsair pilots who achieved ace status and survived the war carried memories of men they had killed, aircraft they had destroyed, the terrible beauty of aerial combat. The German and Japanese pilots who survived carried the trauma of watching comrades die while facing an enemy they could not defeat. The civilians who built these aircraft, often women and minorities entering industrial work for the first time, bore the weight of knowing their labor contributed to both victory and death. The Corsair itself was neither good nor evil. It was simply a machine, an expression of engineering excellence and industrial capability. But the uses to which it was put, the lives it took and saved, the strategic impact it generated, these were profoundly human dimensions. The pilots who flew it described conflicting emotions, pride in their skill and aircraft, horror at the destruction they inflicted, relief at survival, guilt over fallen comrades, satisfaction at victory, and the hollow feeling that came with understanding that killing, even in a just cause, damaged something essential in the human soul. Major Robert Hansen, who achieved 25 victories flying Corsairs before being killed in February 1944, wrote in a letter to his parents shortly before his death, "We fly the best fighter in the world. We train until we can make it perform miracles. Then we go out and use it to kill other men who are also flying their best fighters and performing miracles. They die in fire and terror. We watch them fall and feel satisfaction at our skill, then return to base and realize we have just ended someone's life, destroyed someone's son or brother or father. There is no glory in this, only necessity. We do it because it must be done, because the alternative is worse. But it costs us something every time. I have killed 11 men, 11 pilots who were brave enough to face me in combat. I will probably kill more before this ends. I am good at it. That knowledge disturbs me more than I can explain. The transformation in aerial warfare that the Corsair represented extended beyond tactical or technological dimensions. It marked a fundamental change in how societies organized for war, how industrial capacity determined strategic outcomes, how technological innovation accelerated beyond human ability to fully control or comprehend consequences. The fighter pilots of 1939 had flown aircraft their fathers would have recognized, machines that required skill and courage but remained comprehensible, controllable, human in scale. By 1945, pilots flew aircraft capable of speeds approaching the sound barrier, armed with firepower that could destroy entire formations, supported by radar, navigation aids, and communications systems that transformed aerial combat into something approaching industrial process, rather than individual contest. The romance of aerial combat, the image of knights of the air engaging in honorable single combat, died somewhere over the Pacific and Europe between 1942 and 1945. It was replaced by the grim reality of production statistics, kill ratios, attrition rates, and strategic bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Corsair was part of this transformation, a machine so capable that it made skilled enemy pilots irrelevant, reducing aerial combat to an equation where superior numbers and technology inevitably prevailed. Yet, the human stories persisted beneath the statistics. Stories of courage and skill, of pilots on both sides who faced impossible odds and fought anyway. Stories of innovation and determination, of engineers and workers who created machines of extraordinary capability. Stories of sacrifice, of young men who died in flames over oceans and jungles and cities far from home. These stories deserve remembering, not to glorify war, but to honor the cost of victory and acknowledge the waste of human potential that conflict represents. The Corsair's legacy extends into the present. The aircraft became iconic, its distinctive silhouette recognizable even to those with no interest in aviation history. Air shows feature restored Corsairs performing the same aggressive maneuvers that shocked German test pilots in 1943. Museums display examples with placards listing impressive statistics and battle honors. But the real legacy is carried by the shrinking number of veterans who flew them, fought them, built them, and survived to tell their stories. Their testimony reminds us that behind every technological achievement, every industrial statistic, every strategic victory, there were and are human beings making choices, taking risks, paying costs that cannot be measured in numbers or displayed in museums. The Corsair entered service dismissed by the Navy as unsuitable for its intended purpose, laughed at by enemies who assumed it would be clumsy and ineffective, underestimated by everyone except those who flew it and those who faced it. It ended the war as the dominant carrier fighter in the Pacific, credited with destroying over 2,000 enemy aircraft, remembered by friends and enemies alike as possibly the finest fighter of the entire war. The transformation from rejected prototype to legendary weapon took less than 3 years, driven by pilot skill, engineering excellence, and the harsh teacher of combat experience. But the true transformation was not in the aircraft, but in those who flew and fought it. Young men, most barely old enough to vote, climbed into these powerful machines and emerged as veterans carrying memories that would shape their understanding of courage, duty, sacrifice, and the terrible price of war. Some carried those memories with quiet dignity. Others struggled for decades with what they had seen and done, all understood in ways that those who never faced combat could not. That victory in war is never clean, never simple, never without cost that extends far beyond battlefields and oceans and skies. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.